Okay, so we're going to get started today with a basic introduction to the world of photography. And while this is definitely not a digital photography class, you'll hear me say this over and over again with a variety of things, it is certainly an introduction to a whole bunch of stuff. And I think it would be unfortunate for me to leave out the digital photography section of a digital tools for architects class, because if you're learning to become a designer, you by your nature have to learn a little bit about photography. You have to understand a little bit. Let's say you're working on an architecture project. Chances are you're going to do a site visit. Maybe it's 220 or something like that. You're going to do a site visit. You go out to the site. What do? You take pictures of the site. That would be logical. So if you learn a little bit more about photography and you can take better pictures, your end product when it goes up on the wall will be better. If you took a blurry picture that wasn't very good and wasn't well exposed, and you put it on your board at the end of the semester, it's not going to look so good, right? So let's make that look good. Therefore, let's talk a little bit about the world of photography, and we'll start with the definition of terms. So what do certain things mean? Some of this will be blatantly obvious, like what is a camera body? Basically, a camera body is a black box. It's something that's light-proof that then has a lens attached to it that lets light in or out. Okay? When that light comes in, it hits some kind of a sensitive material. In the old school way of thinking about things, that would be a piece of film, right? Most of you are like, I've never even seen a piece of film in my lifetime. Okay? Some of us are old enough to remember that. Unfortunately, I'm in that category. But now we have a digital sensor that took the place of the film. But it is still a light-sensitive thing, right? It can sense light, and that's the point. Aperture, right, is the circular opening that's in the lens that lets light into the camera body itself. Okay? So aperture is really, really important in the world of photography because it does a lot of things. And we'll talk about what those are in a second. It adjusts the final amount of the image that is actually in focus. It's something called depth of field. And I'll show you a bunch of photographic examples so you understand what I'm talking about in this sense, right? Aperture is referred to as something called f-stop, and you probably have seen this before, an f1.8, an f2.6, something like that. Okay? It's actually an inverse number. So the smaller the f-stop number is, the larger the aperture is, the more light that can come in through the camera. Right? And it can result in a blurred image. So you see like those great images where one thing is in focus and the background's kind of blurred out. That's done through the aperture setting. So this depth of field is exactly what I'm talking about. So in this context, right, we have the photograph on the side here with the leaves in it. Everything in these leaves all around in here is nice and sharp, right? And then we go a little bit further into the background to this leaf, and it gets a little bit blurred. And then we go into the way background over here, and it's very blurry. Okay? All that's achieved with aperture. And so what happens is we want a really large aperture, small f-stop, big circle in the lens, and that's going to give us this blurred background. The opposite would be true for landscape. So let's say we went out to wanted to shoot a picture of the California coast, or we wanted a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, or something like that. We'd want the opposite. We wouldn't want to have the background blurred. We want everything to be in focus. So in that case, it's flip-flopped. So let's go forward here. Right, here's another example here. Just the final petals of the flower are in focus. Right? The background is almost entirely blurred out. This works really well for like a portrait. You're taking a picture of somebody, blurring out the background is nice. If there's something in the background that's really ugly, right? And that happens. Okay, if there's something really ugly, change the aperture setting, make the background blurry, then you don't see the ugly thing. Not a bad strategy. Okay, so here's a contrast. Okay, we have the flowers with the background blurred. This is almost pushing it too far because only the very tip of that flower is actually in focus. Okay? The landscape, the California coast landscape, on the other hand, right? Different, right? We have an f1.8. Remember, that's really big. Then we go to an f8, and that gets almost everything in the image in focus. Right? So you want to think about what it is that what I'm shooting, and what does that mean in terms of the aperture setting on your particular camera. Now, I'm telling you all this stuff about photography and about cameras and all that sort of thing. If you're going to go shoot with your iPhone, don't have much control, right? Think about the size of the lens on your iPhone. It's really, really small. So no matter how big that aperture gets, it still doesn't help a whole lot. Okay? On a digital SLR camera, on the other hand, you can get a lot of light into a particular image. So here it is in a much easier way to explain. Okay? So we start right here with the f16, right? And as we look at that f16, right, it's a small, small hole, right? Almost the entire length of the tape measure here is in focus. Okay? As we jump over, I'll go to this one next, right? The f3.5, a little bit bigger, right? The very center here is nicely in focus. But if we go this direction, it's blurred, and this direction is also blurred, right? So you can see that depth of field is getting smaller. Okay? If we go all the way over here to the f1.4, right there, notice this part that is in focus is very, very tiny. It's almost razor thin. Okay? Everything this way is blurry. Everything this way is blurry. But you can also see the difference right down here. Right? You can see that you can still kind of make out what the tape measure looks like a little bit. Over here, it's almost so blurry that you can't see it at all. Right? So it's really starting to blur out. And so this is what that aperture setting can do for you. And you just want to make sure it matches up with where you're trying to shoot, what you're trying to shoot. So you want to think about that. Shutter speed is another primary factor that affects the overall image that you're taking. Okay, shutter speed is probably the thing that you're most familiar with. If I were to sit up here and ask you about aperture or shutter speed, most of you would probably say, I know shutter speed. Okay? Shutter speed is simply the amount of time that the light is allowed to enter the camera and be on whatever the photosensitive material is. So in the case of a digital camera, the sensor that's in the camera. So how long? And it's usually 1 over some number in seconds. So it's usually 1/125th of a second. Really short, right? 1/1000th of a second is even shorter. Okay? So this is going to affect, right, because it's the light, it's also going to affect movement in a particular shot. Let's say you were out shooting, hold on one second. If you were out shooting a soccer game, right, or a basketball game, you would want this shutter speed to be really high in order to freeze the action of the person. Okay, otherwise it would be blurred. Let's say, on the other hand, you were trying to photograph a waterfall and you wanted it to be all smooth and wispy. You would want the opposite. So again, you want to think about it. You had a question?
Oh, yeah, about the time sheet.
Yes.
So the instructor, that's you.
Instructor is me right here. And you'll write where you're sitting. You should have right on the top left corner of your monitor, it should say ET103- some number. Right? Make sure you're in the right square.
Okay.
All right? Okay, so let's look at some photographic examples here. 1/50th of a second, pretty fast. Okay? Note that the water is a little bit blurred, right? We didn't freeze the individual droplets, but we can still kind of tell that there are droplets. They've just blurred a little bit as they come down. We can see the ripples at the bottom of the pool pretty easily. Okay? As we jump forward, 1/10th of a second, right? You can see that the drops are not so individual. They're starting to smooth out, right? Likewise, we can still see the little bit of ripples at the bottom at 1/10th of a second. Let's go to a half second. The waterfall is getting much wispier. We're not seeing any of the individual drops anymore. We're starting to get long streaks. Okay? Here, the ripples are starting to smooth out at 1/2 second. If we go to 1 second exposure, right, the ripples are almost entirely gone. That's starting to get really smooth. Again, this is getting very smooth. Okay? We're also starting to get way too exposed up in here. We're starting to lose detail in the rocks. Okay? Another example here, 1/60th of a second, right? We've got the spray, the ocean spray captured, frozen. Okay? Something like this at 4 seconds, right? We have no ocean spray, and all of the waves, right, are smoothed out as opposed to being captured. So very different photographs. Okay? Same location, same time of day, same subject matter, very different look. So when you're becoming a photographer, you want to think about which look is what you want to achieve. And these settings will get you there. ISO, or film speed. This is a really weird kind of holdover to the film days. and indulge me for just a second, but when you used to have a film camera, you would go to buy the film, and you would pick a film based on the sensitivity of the film. And it would be an ISO 100 film. Or you'd go, oh, I'm going to shoot action shots. I need it to be really sensitive. I'm going to do an ISO 800 film. Right? So it's kind of old school terminology. However, what digital cameras do is they adjust the sensitivity of the sensor. Right? And some cameras do this automatically. And what ISO does is it lets the more of the light kind of register on the sensor itself. Unfortunately, right, if you shoot at a high ISO, you can get these kind of little pixels. Right? You've probably seen this. You shot with your camera, you shot at night, the light wasn't very good, and suddenly you get all these little grainy pixels that don't look so good. Right? It's because the ISO is really high to compensate for the sensitivity of light. So there's not enough light in the scene. I'll bump the camera says I'll bump the ISO up, and I'll try to make the sensor receive more light. There's not much of it to receive, but I'll take a little bit more. Unfortunately, that results in lots of those little speckled errors. Okay? Some of the better cameras that are out there can shoot at a very high ISO without the noise. So this is an example of an ISO 1600, and it doesn't have much noise because it's a really good quality camera. It's unlikely that your phone is going to be able to shoot something nice. Right? You need something with a big lens, big sensor, a lot of light can get in to the camera in the first place. So here's another example where we walk through a series of steps. And I think these are the kinds of things that are important because we can really easily see what happens. Okay? So we start in the first example, and we get an ISO of 100, right? Right here on the corner, right here. That ISO of 100. Everything's reasonably nice. Everything's reasonably in focus, not a lot of weird noise. It's pretty good. If we move over to the next one, right? Well, actually, let's jump over to maybe the 400 here. If we look at the 400, okay, it's not too bad. There's starting to be a little bit of pixelation up in here, but it's not too bad, not too much noise. The camera did pretty well. If we jump all the way over to this last one at 3200, right, you see that the sensitivity has caused most of this tape measure to get blurry, with lots of little noise. The sharpness of the edge right here, or the edge of the shadow there, right, much, much blurrier than what it would be right over here. You can't read any of the text here. You can read all the text here. Right? So you lose as you bump up that ISO. Okay, so white balance is something that doesn't have anything to do with the old school film cameras, but has everything to do with digital cameras. And that is that it adjusts in white, so to speak. It adjusts how blue or how orange that color of white is. And most cameras are designed to sense, oh, we're here under fluorescent lighting, I'll compensate and try to shoot a neutral image knowing what the light is. I'm outside. Notice, for example, we're inside right here. Right? If I turn these lights on, this light is in this room is a little bit more blue. Okay? If you look out there, the light's more orange. You see the difference? It's subtle, but your camera can adjust for that to make it a neutral, nice white. Okay? So, right, what happens when it's off? We get something like this. Anybody ever had this happen before? The image on the left, it's really blue. It looks like you're maybe underwater. It's because your white balance is off. Okay? The camera thinks that it needs to shift the whole skew of the image to be on the blue side of the spectrum because of the way the light settings were, when in fact this is what the image should really look like. The good news is, in Photoshop or in any of the other post-processing applications that are out there, shifting white balance is really easy. You can drag the slider, it looks great, move on. Okay? But it's something to be aware of. If we were being really technical about it, and I was on a field school that was in Peru with a bunch of archaeologists, and they were trying to document a bunch of stuff on a particular site in Peru, and I'll talk more about it when we get to the panoramic photos a little bit later on this semester. But when we were there, right, when we were in Peru, the archaeologists wanted precision when it came to what the white balance was. So before they shot any photo, they had a blank white card, and they would shoot the photo of the white card first, they'd move the white card away, and then they'd shoot the actual photo with the same settings. So they knew what true white was to compensate for this. To me, that's way over the kill, right? I'd rather just use the automated settings in my camera and guess that it's reasonably good. Did I talk about high dynamic range yet? Bracketing. I skipped a slide. Sorry. Okay, so bracketing happens, and this is something that a lot of digital cameras make it easy to do. And it's where we take a series of images, maybe 3 images, 5 images, 7 images, where the center image is exposed to what the camera thinks is, quote, correct. Okay? Then we deliberately overexpose and underexpose the image to try to capture maybe what was in the shadows for an overexposed image, and maybe what was in the really bright areas for an underexposed image. Okay? It is used very specifically for high dynamic range photography, which is something we will cover in a couple class periods, okay, for how this works. So bracketing is the way that we achieve it, but this is what we get out of it. Anybody tried to take a photo of a sunset before? Right? Most of the time it turns out pretty ugly, right? Right? Or maybe it's pretty, but it's not quite what you saw. It looks different than the actual sunset. That's because our eyes can see in high dynamic range. Our brains are so efficient and so good at processing that as we look around, we can pick up details that are in the dark shadows, and then we can immediately turn and we can look outside and we can see details that are in bright sun, because we compensate for this. So we see the world in high dynamic range. Cameras don't. They see it in low dynamic range. Just one exposure, that's what we get. So high dynamic range is a fusion of those 3 images to get more like what we see in real life. And again, I'll talk at length about this in a couple lectures. Another example here. So aperture and shutter speed have a relationship. If we wanted to take the shutter speed in half, we'd have to double the aperture to get the exact same exposure. So they have an inverse relationship. Okay? So here we go. I have an f11 at 1/60th of a second. If I want to change to an f8, right, I'd have to go to 1/125th of a second. So they compensate for each other. Okay, so exposure value. Let's say that we really wanted to learn the technical strategies of photography, right? And if you took a anybody taken a photography class? Okay, so this is all like old news to you, right? Actually, at one time in this semester, I asked that question, and somebody raised their hand, and I was like, oh, well, what'd you take, or whatever. She's like, I'm a professional photographer. It's like, oh, well, do you want to come up and lecture? You know? She's like, no, it's okay. It's okay. You're hitting it okay. Like, thanks. Anyway, so if we were trying to really learn, right, the world of photography, this kind of a table would be something that we'd want to memorize. And that tells us at a certain exposure value, right, and I'll get to how we know what the exposure value is, right, we could go backwards and forwards and find out. So here's our exposure value. Here, I'll draw this way so that you guys can see it, maybe. Okay, so we have our exposure value running up and down this side right here. If we wanted a specific exposure value, let's say it was 0, right? There's the 0 exposure value right there. And then we can see, oh, I want an aperture of 8. I come down here, right? My shutter speed needs to be, I've covered it all up. Hold on. Can't read it. All right. Yeah, in that case, exposure value of 0, my shutter speed would need to be 60 seconds. So that's really long. Okay? But maybe it's something over here. So how we come up with the exposure value, however, right, is something like this. So we're shooting outdoor, right? And let's say it's a fair or an amusement park. We want an exposure value of 7, right, to be able to expose that correctly. So if we go back here, we wanted an exposure value of 7. Oops. No. Sometimes it just doesn't do what you want, right? There we go. We wanted an exposure value of 7. There's 7, right? We wanted a aperture of, say, 2.0. We'd come down here like that, 1/30th of a second. That would be our correct exposure. Okay? This seems like a lot of work, correct? Okay? So the good news is our cameras have this built in, so we don't have to think about it, which makes life really good. Okay? But I like to at least show you what these charts are and how they work. Okay? We move from exposure value into something called exposure compensation. And this is something that all cameras, including your iPhone, has. Okay? If you're taking a picture with your iPhone, have you ever put your finger on the picture and dragged up or down? It gets lighter, gets darker, maybe? Try it, right? Okay, what this is doing is it's called exposure compensation. It says at 0, this is what the camera thinks a particular exposure would be. This is what it thinks it should be. Okay? So if we deliberately change it, we make it darker, we make it lighter, we're compensating. So we take what the camera thinks, and then we can deliberately darken or deliberately lighten. Okay? It's usually plus 1, minus 1, plus 2, minus 2. Right? If you're struggling on your particular camera with where to find it, I can help you find it. Okay? So this is what exposure compensation does. So we've got here in the middle, that's the correct exposure. If we were to drop the exposure down through exposure compensation to say minus 2, it would get much darker. If we were to raise it up, say plus 1, it would get much lighter. Okay? So again, center image is what the camera thinks is correct, and then we're deliberately compensating to one side or the other. If, for example, you wanted to take a picture of a sunset, chances are you'd be better off if you drop the exposure compensation down a little bit. Okay? So some notes on lighting. So when you're thinking about lighting, you have to think about what is the purpose of your photograph. So I'll go back to that the field school in Peru, when I was in Peru. And I had all the archaeology people that were there. And there was a team of us architects that were there, or architecture students that were there at the same time. Obviously, we were interested in very different things. They were all about, let's accurately document certain things on the site. Right? The site we were at was a place called Tambo, Colorado. It was known for the best well-preserved wall paintings, right, on these mud buildings. So the archaeologists wanted to photograph them in as neutral a setting as possible, etc. So at the middle of the day, when the sun was at its highest, they would run around like banshees taking pictures because it was the right time of day. Right? Meanwhile, all of us architecture students were far more interested in what the overall buildings looked like, or how they felt, or what the experience was like. And we like kind of the long shadows. We like to see that depth. Right? We want to see the little shadows on the windows and all that sort of thing. So at noon, we all sat under the little cabana thing and hung out. Right? But we ran around in the beginning of the day when we first got there, and at the end of the day as the sun was going down. So we could get all that extra shadow, right? That drama. So our purpose was very different. Therefore, we photographed at different times of day. Okay? You guys all, luckily for you, get to go out on campus today and shoot some photos. Well, guess what? It's fairly early in the morning. You're going to get some nice shadows. So it's a good time. Okay? It was really hard when I taught the night class because I couldn't go out and shoot anything. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about file types. You guys are probably all familiar with a file type called the JPEG. It's the most common photographic file type. The fact of the matter is that it is a lossless or a lossy file format. So it's kind of like an MP3, where we take this nice audio file and we strip out the stuff that you can't hear. In a JPEG, we do the same thing. We strip out some of the detail. Right? So it's not quite as good, but it's generally decent. Okay? But it's also kind of the most common. Okay? Most cameras write JPEGs. Okay? But we're going to get into some of the other formats in a second. Okay? So the files are compressed to make them smaller. Right? A raw file that's 16 megabytes might be 1 megabyte when it's in JPEG form. Okay? So big difference in size. Okay? Typically, images are compressed 10 to 1, right? With little visual changes. I say little, not no. So there are some little subtle changes, especially as you zoom in on a particular image. A TIFF, I like to include one file type that is lossless. So this is a bigger file type, but it doesn't lose anything. It's compressed, so it's not as small as a JPEG. It's smaller than a raw image file, but you don't lose any of the detail. Right? So it's a reasonable compromise. It's not that common for digital cameras to write TIFFs. Okay? It's usually either JPEGs or something called a RAW. And a RAW image is considered to be the digital equivalent of a negative. So it's everything that the camera captured when you shot that shot is stored in a RAW file, which means it's a lot bigger. So like I said, a JPEG of 1 megabyte might be 16 megabytes as a RAW image. So a lot more information, a lot more to store. Good news is storage is pretty cheap now, so it's not that bad to shoot as RAW. It allows the most post-processing flexibility. Oh, I screwed up on the exposure a little bit. That's okay. It's a RAW image. I can adjust it. Right? Oh, I made a mistake on something else. Chances are the RAW image will let you fix it. Okay? It does require special decoding software. It's usually built into Windows or Mac or any photo program that you're going to load. So for example, in Photoshop, It's already built into Photoshop, so you really don't have to worry about it. But it is important to note that it does take a little bit of extra decoding, right? And it's generally larger than a JPEG. The one other thing that I'll point out about raw image files is that if you're going to start shooting in it, you just have to anticipate always taking more space, right? So if you have a computer with a hard drive that's relatively small, you're going to be thinking about having an external hard drive to hold them, right? It's just something that you kind of have to get used to. But why would a RAW be relevant? Okay, I told you that you could do some magic post-processing with a raw image file. Okay, so let me show you some of the magic. So in this case, we have the overexposed basic JPEG file. I really want some more detail to come back in that white area. So let me go take it into Photoshop. Let me post-process it, right? Believe it or not, I'm pretty darn good at Photoshop, and this is the best I could make that image. Right? It's just limited because there's just not any more information. Let's say, on the other hand, that this is the same overexposed image, but it's in RAW format instead. Right? I come back in Photoshop or in Aperture or whatever program you're using, Lightroom. Look at all the detail I can get back because it was originally shot in a RAW. So a RAW format can give you a lot more. And I really like to emphasize that, especially because storage is cheap now. Right? You just throw it on a 4 terabyte external drive, no big deal. But it's important to recognize that there is definitely a difference. So let's talk a little bit about your camera. Okay? Your camera has a chip in it, something like this, and this chip is sensitive to the light data. So as the light enters your camera, right, there's a filter that goes over the chip that senses whether it's green light, blue light, or red light. And some combination of those three makes every color. Right? And we'll get to that in color theory a little bit later in the semester. But the point is, those three somehow make up the color. So there's the image, goes into the camera, right? Gets translated by that little chip into little dots, so to speak. Those little dots get written onto a flash drive or a little piece of flash memory or something that you can then take out and start to work with. It's pretty cool, really. If you have a typical compact point-and-shoot camera, you have the basic features that are available. I really should probably have a cell phone example. Things have changed remarkably in 9 years. Okay? This was like the hot stuff thing 9 years ago. Canon PowerShot, baby. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so it had some of the basic stuff. Like you could zoom, right? You could take your pictures. It had a big screen on the back. That was a big deal, et cetera. Right? Now we're all used to cell phones, so this is like, why would you bother carrying this too? Digital SLR, however, certainly does have its advantages. Right? The idea of a camera like this is you can change lenses out, so you can put a different quality lens. You can get more light into the camera. Generally, you can get better results than you can out of any other device that's out there. Okay? A lot more settings. You can do auto bracketing, or you can take those bracketed shots for the high dynamic range images. You just turn that option on. It'll take 7 shots in a row for you. No big deal. Right? So a lot of that stuff is built in, which is nice. The problem is, right, if you walk around with one of these cameras, you look like a tourist because you have this giant camera slung around your neck, right? And I'm guilty. I have one of these. I didn't bring it today. But I'm totally guilty of being on vacation and walking around with it. It's really annoying. Okay? And I will also admit that in the last year or so, I was like, oh, I really don't want to carry the camera around anymore. I'll just rely on my cell phone. And so, our family goes on vacation. I take a bunch of shots with my cell phone. It's like, okay, well, that's fine. Post them to Instagram. Life is good, right? So then we were actually down in Disneyland with my kids, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to pull out the digital SLR, and I'm going to look ridiculous walking around with the camera, but that's fine. So I pulled it out, and I carried it with me for today. I shot significantly better pictures with it. And it caused me to really rethink, do I want to rely just on this to shoot my pictures, or would I really rather shoot really high quality pictures? And so you have to think about it, because there is a big difference. Right? And actually, I should probably put some of those pictures in this slideshow so you could see what the difference was when you change. Anyway, moving on. This is probably the kind of the takeaway thing that I want you to think about, besides composition, which we'll get to in a second. And that is that all of your cameras, except maybe your phone, right, has built-in modes to shoot in, right? And you've probably seen these before, and you've probably ignored them, and you've left it on auto, okay? Even if you don't know anything else about the world of photography, Even if everything that I just talked about for the last half hour just went right through, right? If you do, I'm going to take a portrait. Let me turn it to portrait mode, right? What portrait mode does is it adjusts some settings, blurs out the background, puts the person nicely in focus. Guess what? You have a better quality image because of it. It's way better than auto. Okay? I want to take landscape shots. Let me switch to the landscape mode setting. Right? Again, we know what happens in a landscape mode. It makes the aperture really small so that everything's in focus. Okay? But just by switching to that mode, we're consciously saying that's the kind of photo I want to take. Right? And if you understand what it does, so portrait mode blurs the background, large aperture, you can start to use that to your advantage. I'm not taking portrait shots anymore, but I want the background to be blurred. I'll shoot in portrait mode. Right? I want everything to be in focus. I'll shoot in landscape mode. Okay? Sports mode, freeze the action, high shutter speed. Right? Really quick shutter speed. Maybe you want to freeze a waterfall. It's not really a sport, but that's what you want out of it. Does that make sense? So if you use these, it'll greatly improve your shooting. Okay? The ideal place, I believe, is somewhere right down here at the bottom in the aperture or shutter priority. I shoot in aperture priority a lot because I want to adjust the aperture only and then have the camera do everything else. So aperture, I want you to set at 1.8 so I blur the background really nicely and I can shoot in low light. Camera, you adjust everything else and make it look good. That's perfect, right? Because I know what I want in the aperture. Right? The other option would be to go into portrait mode. Okay? If I were handing my camera off to, say, my wife to take a picture or something like that, I would use something like portrait mode rather than this, because you have to know more about focusing and what point you're metering off of and that sort of thing. So this is definitely more on the advanced side, but it certainly gets you even better quality images. Personally, I would never actually shoot full manual. Right? I would be lost. I like the computer to compensate or the camera to compensate. So when you're configuring your image options, number one, you want to think about how big is your card, the memory card that's in your camera, or how big is your phone? How much can you store on your phone? That sort of thing. Right? We're starting to get better about it on phones because you have things like the iCloud photo, whatever, where it stores it in the cloud. You don't really have to worry about it anymore. But the point is you want to be aware. Right? If you know that you go on vacation and you typically shoot 1,000 photos, do you have enough memory space on your camera to shoot those 1,000 photos? Whatever it is, you want to be thinking about that. Okay? How many images are you planning to shoot? What will the final output be? If you're just posting it to Facebook or something and you're never going to print it, you don't have to worry so much. Right? But if you ever want that image to be printed, you've got to shoot in a little higher quality. Okay? So obviously, I recommend RAW. I like RAWs if we can. So what do you carry with you? It depends on how hardcore you are. Okay? But you might want to consider things like extra batteries, lens cleaner because things get dirty, maybe an extra memory card, maybe you want a tripod. If you have a digital SLR, do you carry a bunch of lenses? Right? Before you know it, you have a 30-pound backpack that you're carrying, but you have all this great stuff with you. Right? Well, anyway. So that might be good. Maybe you have some extra specialty stuff like the panorama head or whatever. I'm going to bring that in when we talk about panoramas so you can see that. And you can see how ridiculous it is to carry it around. Right? I still don't know how they let me on an airplane with it, but whatever. The other thing you want to think about is, are you allowed to take pictures wherever you are or of whatever you're taking pictures of? Sometimes there's restrictions, and you want to be sensitive to those restrictions. Sometimes you can't shoot with a flash, but you can shoot without a flash. Okay, well, that's okay. You can compensate for that. Sometimes you take a picture of somebody and they get really mad that you took a picture of them. Right? You want to be aware of those kinds of things. Right? You can have the ongoing battle with somebody over, are you allowed to post that picture or not on Instagram, right? My wife and her mother have very different opinions about what is an acceptable photo to print or to post on Instagram, and they argue over it all the time. So you want to be aware of that. The other thing is, inevitably, it will rain, right? So this was that Peru trip. We were up at Machu Picchu, and it was complete downpour, right? So you have to be prepared. You're hiking, we're on the Inca Trail, it starts raining, what are you going to do? Right? A lot of camera bags have great little covers that you can put over them to keep the camera stuff dry. I actually got in the habit of in my camera bag, and I can show you this when I bring it in, you know those like silica gel pack things that you get like when you buy something from Cost Plus or whatever, those things? Right? I used to collect those, and I still do when there's a nice, good, big one, and I throw it in the bottom of my camera bag. right? And if they start to get grungy or they break open, you throw them away. But they absorb moisture, which is great. So if you get on an airplane and you get off and the humidity is different or whatever and your bags are cold, and instead of having everything in your bag fog up because of the moisture, you have that little moisture pack. It'll absorb everything. It's a good trick. And it's free, even better. OK, so let's talk about basic composition techniques. If nothing that I've talked about so far today has sunk in, let's hope this does. Okay, this is critical because not only is it relevant to the world of photography, it's relevant to everything that we're doing from this day forward. You do a poster, you do a big board at the end of your 121 class or 220 class, right? All these compositional techniques are still relevant. You want to be thinking about them. Okay, so let's go through basic composition techniques. The first one is telling a story, right? And this usually has to do more with mood or lighting or causing somebody who's looking at the photo to want to be in the photo, to cause somebody to be interested in the photo. And so how do we do that, right? We try to capture certain elements of the flow, that are in the photo that cause you to be interested and want to move in. Roads, trails, those kinds of things are great. Maybe it's about lighting, right? So this wasn't the best photo. Okay, I took it when I was in St. Peter's in Rome. It's a little blurry. I could nitpick a lot of the details of it. It would have been better if I shot it with a tripod, right? But it captured a lot of what it felt like to be in this space, right? Because you were standing in this very grand space. And this is one of the side galleries. It's not even in the main St. Peter's. Anybody been to St. Peter's before? Right? It's way bigger, isn't it? It's huge. Like huge, huge. Like we have no concept in the United States what huge is. That huge. Anyway, what it feels like to be in a space like this with these huge volumes of space around you, and then you have this light coming in, streaming in, and it's a certain feel. And so when you're taking the photograph, you want to tell that story. You want to tell what it feels like to be in that particular place, right? Maybe it's something like this, right? Up in the Swiss Alps. And what we can do here is we can follow the little trail that runs along and runs along and runs along and runs along and runs along, you know, and goes all the way through the image. And that causes you to start to look at the image and get interested in the image, right? So maybe it's a road, a trail, something like that. Next one is an example. And it's too dark to see. You guys can see it better online afterward if the website works again. But it's a lot about this mood, right? This was up in the Andes again. And it was the way the light was hitting, kind of trying to capture that particular moment. So the next compositional technique is a little bit more structured. It's something called symmetry. Okay? Well, you say, wait a minute, symmetry is easy. I can do that, right? Just make the two sides look the same. Okay? The key to symmetry is that you want really strong symmetry and then something that breaks it. And what is that little piece that breaks it is what matters, right? So something like this, Brooklyn Bridge in New York, very, very strong symmetry, one to the other, right? The thing that breaks it, all the people on the right side, not on the left, right? The reason they're not on the left is because that's the bike lane, but that doesn't matter. The point is that there's something off. Like what is different about this particular photo that draws your attention? So you've got this great symmetrical composition, and you've got all the people on one side, right? So you want to think about what it is that's breaking it. Right, something like this, very strong. It's a little blurry. I apologize for that. Very, very strong. Right, the pile of dirt in the corner breaks that. So that's focusing your attention on something specific in the image. Radial is a little bit harder to capture. There's not a lot of good examples of radial. I don't know. Somehow for me, it's always been a little bit more challenging. But the point is that there's something very strong right at the center of the image, and that everything else radiates away from that. Okay? So let's go to the Swiss Alps here up on a glacier. Right? We have a strong tension point right here between these two icicles or whatever they are, right? In an ice cave, right, with the sky and stuff in the background. This is very much a symmetric or a radial composition because of that space right at the center. Right? If this were off center, it wouldn't feel the same. Right? So we want it focused. Right? Tunnels and stuff like this are great too, because we have a strong focal point in the center. Everything radiates out from that particular point. Okay? Example here of the inside of a hot air balloon. Strong focal point. Everything radiates out from it. Okay? Much harder to do a radial composition. Diagonal, right? We have a strong diagonal element that's captured in the image. This works really well with perspective, right? In this case, it's a macro shot of sand up at Sea Ranch, right? This look familiar, right? It's the book drop, but there's some pretty good strong diagonals as part of this composition, right? Another example here of a strong diagonal perspective, that sort of thing. Overlapping layers. This is when you use something, and it works really well in architecture. You have one building, and it partially hides another building, which partially hides another building, right? So we have these overlapping layers. Maybe we're looking through a window into something else. Those kinds of overlapping layers can be really nice. So I told you about Tombo, Colorado. This was that field school, right? We spent 3 weeks looking at mud. But, right, these kinds of, you walk through the door around the corner, there's the window into the next level. It's that sort of thing. So let's look at it from further away so you can kind of see it. This is obviously the kind of shot that the architects like, right? The drama of the shadows coming across. But you've got this layering of pieces going backward, right? So those overlapping layers can be very nice as a compositional technique. Maybe something like this, right, where we have this nice kind of foreground here. Let me draw on this instead of pointing at it, right? We have the nice foreground here. That's one layer. Then we have the water as layer 2. So this is 1, this is 2, right? We move back to this right there, which is 3. And then we get all the way back to the water at the back, which is 4. Right? So we're stepping our way back through these layers. Okay? That works nicely as a composition. Okay. Rule of thirds. Anybody heard of the rule of thirds before? Okay. If you're setting up and you're going out to shoot, generally speaking, if you follow the rule of thirds, you're going to get good images. It's almost just automatic. Right? So when in doubt, do it. The other thing that can be helpful is on every one of your cameras or your phones or whatever, you can turn on grid. You guys seen this before? There's an option for grid. If you turn that grid on and you start to use that to align, you're going to look better. Okay, so let's talk about what rule of thirds actually does. Okay, so we take an image that's like this of New York, right? We want part of the image to line up a third of the way over, right? So we go 1/3, there's 2/3. It's not centered, right? It's 1/3, 2/3. Okay? In an ideal sense, we're also going to go 1/3, 2/3. Let's go one more slide here. There we go. Right? We've centered this on that 1/3, 2/3 rule, and suddenly it's a nice composition. It doesn't take too much to do it. Now, if I put Statue of Liberty right here, looking that way, it would be kind of awkward, right? Because she's looking off the photo. And I'll show you an example of this in just a second. When you follow the rule of thirds, but you're not thinking about what's in the photo, right? So we want to make sure that those kinds of things work well. Okay, so another example of rule of thirds. There's third. There's a third. Okay? It doesn't have to be exact. Maybe this is more of quarter, right? But the point is, it's in the lower. We also have a line that's up there at the upper. Okay? Okay, so here's an example. Rule of thirds, right? You go to take a picture of somebody, right? The natural reaction when you go to take a picture of somebody is to put the person in the center. Anybody done that before? Right? Automatic. Center. There we go, take our picture. Right? Not a very dynamic image at all. Okay? If you move the person to the third mark, right, you end up with 2/3 on one side where the person is looking, right, and 1/3 on the back side. Right? Likewise, if we come down to a third, eye line, come down a third again, bottom of the grass. Okay? That's part of how we line things up. So there's the third line, person's on there, eye line is the third line as well. Okay? If, however, we did the rule of thirds and did it this way, it's not a particularly good photo, is it? Right? It meets the rule of thirds, right? But we have to think about who's in the photo. Right? So he's still a third of the way over-ish. Right? His eyes are still at a third, but he's looking the wrong way. So we've got all this stuff going on over here that we don't care about. Okay? So when you're setting this up, you want to think about the content, who's in the photo, what they're doing in the photo, and make sure that it's the correct direction. Does that make sense? Okay, another example here. This could be a strong diagonal too. but that falls a third of the way over, right? Again, it'd be really easy to just center the helicopter. But by doing it this way, we have a rule of third. We've got all this that we can imagine about where the helicopter is going. Right? That's part of it. It's leaving that open-ended. All right, another example here. Right, there's our 1/3 line, like that. Okay, so here's the example of you hike to the top of the mountain. Right? You want to take a picture. You don't put yourself in the center. Right? By putting yourself over here at the 1/3 mark, you get a much better context of where you were, what you hiked, and it's a much stronger photo. Okay, so we get ourselves out of that center frame. There we are, at a third. All right, another example here where we've got third line there. There's the lower third. There's also an upper third. Right, just in terms of framing up the composition. Okay, so framing is another strategy here where we have strong lines in a photograph. We're shooting through a window, and that's causing us to focus and look at something. Right, so let's go. I think the first one's Pompeii. Right, here we go. Right, we have a really strong frame right there. It's having us look out to the Bay of Naples. Make sense? Right, strong frame. Patterns and repetition. These are really fun. Okay, and again, this is a lot like symmetry, where we take a pattern and we put something that's out of place in it. Right, and you have to look for that something that's out of place. Right, good, strong pattern. What's out of place? Right, the shirt or the swim trunks or something. Right. So you want those little nuggets to appear in the photo that make something like this really interesting to look at. Right? If those little swim trunks were there, this would still be a nice geometric composition, but it's not the same as having little bits of swim trunks. Now, if it were up to me, I'd rather have the swim trunks be on the rule of thirds. Right? So I'd rather have them down here or maybe over here, right? So they're not centered in the image. But you get the idea. Right? Something like this, we have this pattern going back. It's very symmetrical, right? And then we have the waiter crossing between the two, right? Blurred figure. But at the same time, that's the movement. That's the excitement. That's the piece that doesn't belong, right? So we have a pattern and then something that breaks the pattern, right? Something like this where we have the pattern and then the snow that's left melted on it breaks the pattern, right? So it's always about the pattern and then something that breaks the pattern. Okay, so today, you're going to go out on campus. You do not have to come back after you're done, right? So you're free to go. And you have some homework to do. Okay, so you are going to use the presets that are on your camera if you can. If you're shooting with your iPhone, at least do the exposure compensation where you touch in the center at what's focused and then you drag it up or down to make it look nice. Okay? And you're going to take 5 photographs of campus buildings. Okay? I'll be amazed if one of you takes a photo that I haven't seen already. Okay? 5 images of people, all right, walking, grouping together, singing, I don't know, whatever, doing something. Okay? You may want to ask them ahead of time if I can take your picture. Okay? The difference here is we're not exactly looking for like the group of people all standing, hey! That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for them doing something, like I have somebody sitting reading or something like that, right? There is method to my madness. There's a reason that I'm asking you for that. We will use it later on, okay? 5 detail images of textures or patterns, right? Good place to use what we were talking about, patterns and repetition, something that's out of place, right? Something along those lines, okay? 5 photographs taken from unexpected angles. That one usually results in the best photos. Okay? 4 macro or close-up photos. Okay? 1 bracketed set of images if you can do it. If not, I'll have samples that you can use for that part of class. 1 handheld set of panoramic images. That just means 2 or 3 images that will stitch together to make a bigger image. Again, I'll have samples if you don't have something that turns out today. Okay? I know on your phone you can just hit the pano and do the thing. Yeah, I get it. Take 3 pictures. We're going to stitch them together. I'm trying to teach you something, okay? A self-portrait, it's always entertaining. And then 25 or more images of your choice. Okay, they don't have to be taken on campus, just sometime in the next couple days. You're going to bring them on Wednesday, okay? And the idea here is I want you to get excited, take some pictures that are different lighting conditions, etc. There's no right and there's no wrong answer to those 25 extras. Starting in class on Wednesday, we're going to start working to learn how to work in Photoshop and post-process and make your images look better. Right? We'll talk about workflows to do that, etc. Cropping, levels, histograms, all that sort of thing. Okay? So in order for you to do that, you need images. So the more images you have to pick from, the better. Okay? Okay, and I do put a challenge on there. Okay, and I'll answer your question, I promise. Okay? I do put a challenge on there, and that is to take, I've thought about making this a first assignment. I haven't done it yet. Okay? But that is to take 30 pictures of your mailbox. 30 different pictures of your mailbox. And at the beginning, it sounds like, oh, I could do that. It's not that hard, right? Well, I'd say you could get to 10 really easy. And if you stretched yourself, you could get to 20. Maybe you could get to 25. 30's hard. It's really hard, you know? And you start to think about ideas like, well, you could open it with the mail in. You could open it with mail out. You could stick a card. I mean, you start to think about it, and you'll get to maybe 20, 25. It's those last 5 that are really hard. Right? Anyway, I read about it one time, and I've seen people who've tried to do it, and it's really entertaining. So if you want a challenge, there's your challenge for you. This is all leading towards your first assignment, right, which will be your best photograph with some post-processing done to it. You will get your assignment handout next class, so you'll be able to read about what it is. You can't, for the assignment, you can't go backwards in time and take something that you shot over the summer. Right? It has to have been shot currently. If you want to bring some images that you shot over the summer to work on for the post-processing for the exercises, totally fine. Okay? But when it comes to the assignment, you're going to be stuck having to take a relatively new photo. Okay? So I'm just giving you that warning ahead of time. Did I answer it? Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? You guys are a silent bunch when it comes to questions. You haven't learned to interrupt me and get me on tangents just yet. It'll happen. Okay.
The trade-off between ISO and shutter speed. If you have control over both, which one is one that you are more likely to...
Depends on how high your camera can shoot without getting noise in your ISO.
And what do you mean by noise? You mean the grains?
The little grains. And so different cameras have different settings. And you can Google a specific camera and what's the max good ISO without noise,
So
and
if
it'll tell you.
want to avoid grains, that's the first thing.
Right, exactly.
And mailbox, you mean the physical mailbox?
Yes.
Where the postman delivers it?
Yes.